Hello, starfarers. Welcome to the Tetra Galaxy Telecast. For our first transmissions topic, I will be taking a look at the Video Game Hall of Fame, which recently rang the ears of the gaming world by adding 3 new members to its collection. But more specifically, I will be discussing if Super Metroid should be brought into the score of honored games by judging its merits within the categories used to judge a game's Hall of Fame worthiness, and then comparing it to the games that currently have a spot there. Now I know you may be thinking, why Super and not the original Metroid? Well, I'm choosing to cover this game because the original was already nominated back in 2018, but didn't get in, and I believe Super Metroid would naturally be the first choice after the original. But without further delay, let's begin. The 4 categories used to determine whether a game should be brought into the Hall of Fame are, and I quote, 1. Icon status is widely recognized and remembered. 2. Longevity is more than a passing fad and has enjoyed popularity over time. 3. Geographical reach meets the above criteria across international boundaries. 4. Influence has exerted significant influence on the design and development of other games, on other forms of entertainment, or on popular culture and society as a whole. So I'll be breaking the criteria down into each of its 4 parts, starting with icon status. In my eyes, Super Metroid should undoubtedly pass this category. I think it's safe to say it's among the most iconic games for the Super Nintendo alongside Super Mario World, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Donkey Kong Country. Google seems to agree with me. Just look up the most important SNES games, and those are the 4 games that pop up first. And at that, Super Metroid appears before even Zelda or DKC. It also tracks on Google as the 4th result for best SNES games, 8th result for most popular SNES games, and 5th result for most famous SNES games. Even moving beyond its home console, it's one of only 51 games, and yes, considering all the games that have ever been made, 51 is not a lot, to appear when searching for greatest games of all time. Up there with games that outsold it by orders of magnitude. Metroid Prime is also on that list, and trust me, that'll be important later. Speaking of greatest games of all time, Super Metroid is very regularly in that discussion, as it was voted the 5th greatest game ever made on IGN's most recent Top 100 Games list, which was updated just 3 months ago, on March 4th, 2023. It was also number 4 on their 2019 list, along with ranking 3rd in 2003, 10th in 2005, 7th in 2007, and 6th in 2008, all showing its long-standing status as one of the best games ever made. IGN may fall under fire for many of their malign practices, namely stealing, but despite those issues, it's undeniable that a major game site holding one game in such high regard for so many years is indicative of its sustained popularity. All of this pairs nicely with its initial critical reception, as upon release, it reached critical acclaim across the board. Just look at this chart and you'll see what I mean. I could go on and on about its innumerable entries into the top 10s and top 5s of list after list, but I think you get the point by this point. Super Metroid is recognized as one of the most renowned games ever made, and has been held up to such high regard from as far back in the past as it's existed, to the very moment in time that you hear this transmission. Even off of major news outlets, many individuals would also claim the game as their personal favorite of all time. Even making a simple social media post, like I did here, asking if it's the greatest game ever, several take to claiming that it is. Of course, others disagreed, bringing up other fantastic games that they believe hold that title. Metroid Prime was one of those games that got mentioned as being the true king of games, and again, this will be important later. The point I'm trying to make though, is that if I can make a simple Reddit post asking if anybody thinks the game is the greatest game ever made, and garner hundreds of responses and upvotes, with several of those responses being a clear yes, then it's clearly still in the public conscience as a GOAT of gaming. Lastly, for what it's worth, it's also my personal favorite of all time, which of course is why I'm making this video. But enough about me. I think it's time I bring your attention to the next category: longevity. The next category would be longevity, which I also think Super Metroid clears with ease. The game is still very active today, spearheaded by a very large and dedicated speedrunning community. The game sits at number 6 all-time on GamerRanks for most submitted speedruns at 10,132 as of December 6, 2021, over the likes of its Super Nintendo brethren Super Mario World and A Link to the Past. On speedrun.com, Super Metroid sits at number 11 all-time, with 11,943 runs, a site which updates regularly. That's all without mentioning Super's stellar track record at AGDQ, where it's been well known for being the headline and highlight of the event, with the choice to save or kill the animal at the end of the game, drawing in hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations to decide their fate, including this famous clip.
Someone donated $10,000 right at the end. Wow.
Going back to Google, it also appears as a top result when searching for most famous AGDQ games, even over the likes of the world-renowned Pepsi Man. Okay, I just thought it was funny that Pepsi Man was there at number 2. Anyway, beyond speedrunning, the game has been ported over to the Virtual Console for Nintendo's last 4 systems in a row, being the Wii, 3DS, Wii U, and Switch, cementing itself as a staple of Nintendo's library. Super Metroid is also still cited as the best game in the franchise by many Metroid fans, like the aforementioned Reddit post showed, and many outside the community as well, which of course I mentioned earlier with its placement at or near the top of many all-time games lists. Many references to honor the Titan title have been made too. The Edacoons, a friendly species that teaches Samus how to wall jump in Brinestar's green area, were referenced in Jedi Survivor, which came out just 1 month ago as of this broadcast. I think it's safe to say that Super Metroid is and has been quite popular for a long time, and with Metroid Dread breathing new life into the series and becoming the highest selling game in the franchise, Super is set to draw in more players than ever before, and thus enjoy new heights as yet unmatched even in the long history of its continued popularity. Now, to be completely honest, the strong don't exactly highlight their requirements for geographical reach and big neon lights, so I'm not entirely sure if Super Metroid would clear this category. With that being said, I'll wager my bets that the game meets the necessary requirements, having been released in at least North America, Europe, and Japan. North America is host to 23 countries, Europe 44, and Japan, well, it's Japan, I hope you know it's just one country. Still, by releasing in those 3 regions, Super Metroid should have released in at least 68 countries, not counting any of its Virtual Console ports, which should be enough for the game to meet the Hall of Fame's requirements. I'm also willing to bet that if the original Metroid could get nominated, which we mentioned earlier, Super shouldn't have a problem with this category. This is all a little speculative, without having any strict guidelines to adhere by, but having been released in as many countries as it did, and knowing NES Metroid could be nominated, I think this category is a non-issue either way. This is the category I think Super Metroid's Hall of Fame case rides on the most, as Super is nothing to the gaming world, if not influential. I've already talked about the massive speedrunning community the game has, but I should mention how that speedrunning community got there. That's because this game was arguably the most important game in speedrunning's development. only challenged by the original Doom and Super Mario 64. The in-game timer the game shares with you at the end of the game, and the different appearances Samus has depending on the player's time, encourage the player to push for the fastest time possible. And being among the first to do these, along with its popularity, it became crucial in the development of the larger speedrun community, which in turn made the game the popular run it is today. Now I know trying to beat games as fast as possible has been around since the day games were born, but Super Metroid was one of the quintessential games of the development of organized and massively popular speedrunning, rather than simply running through a stage at full speed with friends and hoping that you didn't die like before. In speedrunning alone, Super Metroid is one of the most important games of all time, but on top of that, it's also responsible for the birth of an entire genre of games, Metroidvanias. The genre was made due to Super Metroid's massive critical success, and the many fans who adore the game's level design and atmosphere, among other aspects. Had Super Metroid not been such a hit, indie games like Hollow Knight, the Ori games, Dead Cells, Axiom Verge, Guacamelee, and SteamWorld Dig, and even major titles like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and of course, the subsequent Metroid games, of which most follow almost entirely in Super's footsteps, would almost certainly not exist. The argument over its influence on the gaming world becomes hilariously lopsided, if it wasn't already, once you consider the fact that Metroid Prime is pretty much Super in 3D, a mostly perfect translation of what Super accomplished 8 years before. In its own right, 2002's greatest advancement to society has inspired a multitude of massively popular games, including but not limited to the Dark Souls franchise, the modern Doom games, and EA's Jedi duology, the last of which contain the aforementioned Etakun reference. My line of reasoning is very simple. Without Super Metroid, Prime wouldn't exist, or at least not in the form we know it today. And without Prime, the Souls games, modern Dooms, and Jedi games, among other unlisted titles, wouldn't exist in their current state today either. So, by being arguably the most important game in the history of speedrunning, creating an entire genre near single-handedly, and inspiring countless touted titles like Hollow Knight, Symphony of the Night, Metroid Prime, and by proxy games like Dark Souls, and many, many more, Super Metroid's influence has extended beyond its life, and etched itself in history. With the 4 categories cleared, I think some quick comparisons to its competition are in order. Seeing as I've laid out the reasons for why Super Metroid easily passes the parameters needed to get into the Hall of Fame, I'm going to quickly compare the games already inducted to Super Metroid, and give my verdict on whether or not the game currently in the Hall deserves its spot over our Cho-Zodian challenger. I'll be splitting the 40 inducted games into 4 tiers, with Tier 1 being the games that definitely deserve to be in over Super Metroid, Tier 2 being the games Super is on par with in their Hall of Fame worthiness, and Tier 3 being games that Super Metroid should certainly be in over. Tier 0 is reserved for PC games, because I really don't know enough about PC games' history and influence to reach a good faith verdict. With that said, some games are absolute Tier 1s. Even I'm not going to argue that Super Metroid deserves to get in over Super Mario Bros. The others that deserve to be in over Super Metroid, fairly definitively, to me would be Doom 1993, The Legend of Zelda, Pac-Man, Minecraft, Donkey Kong, Pokemon Red and Green, Tomb Raider, Pong, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Sonic the Hedgehog. After that, Super is at least comparable to the remaining titles, but I wouldn't say it has a definitive leg up on or below 2 of the new additions, being The Last of Us and Wii Sports. And it's also in the same range as Mortal Kombat, Miss Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Dance Dance Revolution, GTA 3, Super Mario Kart, John Madden Football, Final Fantasy VII, Halo Combat Evolved, and Street Fighter 2. That leaves Tier 3, which consists of Barbie Fashion Designer, Computer Space, Tetris, Space War, Centipede, Animal Crossing, and Minecraft Solitaire, of which most are only here because of some gimmick or other, and the rest just aren't as deserving of their spot as Super Metroid is. I mean, Tetris is only up here because it sold 50 tetrillion copies, though I will say, if any game in Tier 3 would move up above Super Metroid, it would be this one. I just think its influence is too limited to just influencing other puzzle games. The others are cozily staying in Tier 3 though. Barbie's fashion designer is only up here because it was marketed solely at girls. Computer Space and Space War only made it because they're the video game equivalents of hieroglyphics. Microsoft Solitaire shouldn't even be eligible in my opinion, because it's literally just solitaire. But it does technically count, so it sits in Tier 3. The original Animal Crossing, I'd argue, is Tier 3 by default, since the home console Animal Crossing games have never been as popular or important as the portable games, so even within its series it shouldn't be there. And Centipede? That doesn't deserve to be in there at all. Well, full stop, I don't even know why it's there. I feel like this, of all games, deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. I'd like a word. Now, maybe I'm being a tad harsh about Centipede specifically, but the point still stands. All the games in Tier 3, except probably Tetris, do not deserve their spot in the Hall of Fame when comparing them to Super Metroid, to me. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, The Sims, World of Warcraft, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, Sid Meier's Civilization, Colossal Cave Adventure, Microsoft Flight Simulator, StarCraft, The Oregon Trail, Bejeweled, and King's Quest are all PC games, so they go in Tier 0. All told, I believe it's safe to say that Super Metroid should have comfortably made its way into the Hall of Fame over a good portion of these games, though not an overwhelming majority. All in all, I think Super Metroid has a star-studded resume all around, especially in the influence category, being the reason many beloved classics exist the way they do today. The game today is arguably more popular than it ever was before due to the current revival of the Metroid franchise, and even with the scrutiny that naturally comes with more eyes being on any product, let alone a video game, Super has still effortlessly maintained its long-standing reputation as arguably the greatest game ever made. I'm not saying any of the games in the Hall of Fame currently don't deserve to be there at all, well, except for maybe Centipede. But I think it's hard to argue against my point that a handful of these games don't deserve their inductions over the genre-creating, speedrun pioneering juggernaut whose level design and atmosphere have creeped their way into countless other titles. Then again, all of this is simply my opinion, which you of course could deeply disagree with. So what do you think? Does Super Metroid deserve to be in the Strong's Video Game Hall of Fame? Am I insane for putting Tetris in my own personal Tier 3? I'd love to hear from each and every one of you in the digital reply box down below, as station feedback is always helpful in improving the show. The last thing I'd like to do for my inaugural telecast is to give my thanks to some particular people. For one, thank you to everyone who participated in my recent Reddit post. Your responses to my question were not only entertaining, but also insightful and intriguing, and they helped fill a mostly objective lensed and borderline statistical section with a much needed subjective, personal flair. That, and I'd like to shout out 2 specific YouTubers who were a massive help to me. Your videos were what motivated me to make this Metroid telecast, and hopefully many more to come, to begin with. And your advice is how I figured my way through the editing process of these broadcasts. So to both the Lore Raider and Zeratone, thank you. But that's enough sentiment for one show. That will be all for today's transmission. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you next broadcast.